us to give a brief round of applause to Roy Speckhart. Roy is, of course, our fearless leader, and to many of you, if you think of Roy as sort of calm, cool, and collected, you're right. But as a boss, he's that, but he's also very engaged and very responsive. And so I just want to thank you, Roy, for 9 years, I can't believe it, of working together. So it's a real honor and a privilege tonight for me to present the Humanist of the Year Award to Lawrence Krauss. I've been thinking, I wanted to say something. I just learned this tonight. To get here this evening to speak to us, he just yesterday was filming 4,000 meters up in the Andes, a feature film by a major director with an all-star cast. That's all I know. He left, it took 4 flights to get here. One of them, I think he said he arrived at the airport, it was locked, and there was a dog out front, and that was about it. So really, I mean, it's wonderful that you're here, and we're really glad you actually made it. I've been looking at the Humanist of the Year list of past recipients of late, because as I told you yesterday, the Humanist magazine is turning 75 next year, as is the AHA, and we're doing an anniversary issue of the magazine. So I've been, sort of looking at names and contacting Humanists of the Year to solicit their contributions to our anniversary issue. And Dr. Krauss, I hope you'll be on board. That would be fantastic. And when you look at this list of names over the decades, you think really about all of these individuals and what they have contributed to our knowledge, to society, to humankind. It's just so impressive, and it's a bar that's so high and it's so even. And I've also been looking at the list because we did an article recently that touched on, in the 60s and 70s, there were a number of Humanists of the Year that came from this field of psychology. So you had Eric Fromm and B.F. Skinner, Abraham Maslow, Albert Ellis, and Carl Rogers. And then we've also had a number of novelists throughout the year. Isaac Asimov, of course, and Kurt Vonnegut, Margaret Atwood, Joyce Carol Oates, and Alice Walker. And we've also had a number of physicists, Steven Weinberg, Carl Sagan, of course, and Murray Gell-Mann. And now we add to that list Lawrence Krauss. A friend of mine named Phil is a physics guy, and he told me a story about Lawrence Krauss. Phil was writing a book about Freeman Dyson. So he interviewed Dr. Krauss for, I don't know, an hour or so in a hotel bar. And Phil said, I was so impressed because in that time, Dr. Krauss got 3 phone calls, one from the Pentagon, one from the Los Angeles Times, and one from Christopher Hitchens. So, it just really gives you a slice of kind of the scope and the level, the height of his reach. Lawrence Krauss has had an extensive and impressive career in theoretical physics. He received his undergraduate degrees in mathematics and physics from Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and his, all right, we got a fellow alumni there, and his PhD in physics from MIT. He joined the Harvard Society of Fellows and later the Department of Physics and the Department of Astronomy at Yale. He was the chairman of the physics department at Case Western University from 1993 to 2005. Lawrence Krauss is currently the foundation professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration and Physics Department at Arizona State University, where he's also the head of the Origins Project. His research spans a real vast collection of specialties, from exploding stars to the origin of mass in the universe, focusing on the interface between elementary particle physics and cosmology. The Scientific American heralds him as what they say is kind of a rarity, that he's a scientific public intellectual. And so Lawrence Krauss writes for The New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He co-starred with Richard Dawkins in 2013 in the documentary The Unbelievers, which we screened the other night. And something I noticed in the movie was that he has a really impressive collection of Chuck Taylor's sneakers. And so I wore mine tonight as an homage. And I want to thank you for that, because the dress shoes I've been wearing all weekend were starting to get really uncomfortable. And also, Lawrence Krauss was the executive producer of that film. He's appeared in the Discovery Channel's How the Universe Works. He's the author of many popular books, including the international bestseller The Physics of Star Trek, published in 1995, and the I guess a fan, and the 2012 New York Times bestseller A Universe from Nothing. Lawrence Krauss has received a slew of prestigious awards. He's been recognized by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, so many prestigious bodies. In 2001, the American Institute of Physics awarded Krauss the Andrew Gemmott Award, given annually to, quote, a person who has made significant contributions to the cultural, artistic, or humanistic dimensions of physics. And in fact, he's the only physicist to have received the most prestigious award from the top 3 major physics societies in the United States. And over the course of his career, he's authored over 300 scientific publications and popular articles on physics and astronomy. A biographical note of his that I found really interesting, he was nominated for a Grammy for the liner notes of a CD of Star Trek music. And we were discussing it at dinner, do they even do liner notes anymore? I don't know. But that's totally cool. And in 2005, he served as a jury member of the Sundance Film Festival. But really, I think most importantly for this group, Lawrence Krauss has always been an advocate for science education and a real firebrand for the cause of scientific humanism. Throughout his career, he's been very vocal about the toxic interference of religious thought in the world of science, and he advocates for creating distance between oppressive ideologies and the reality and the future that is science. In a March 15th New Yorker article titled Teaching Doubt, Krauss addresses America's discomfort in discussing evolution. Yes, it's still very uncomfortable for so many people, and our society's sensitivity toward religious belief, advising that we shed discomfort in pursuit of a better world. And I'm going to wrap up just by reading a quick excerpt from that article. Lawrence Krauss writes, "One thing is certain. If our educational system does not honestly and explicitly promote the central tenet of science, that nothing is sacred, then we encourage myth and prejudice to endure. We need to equip our children with tools to avoid the mistakes of the past while constructing a better and more sustainable world for themselves and future generations. We won't do that by dodging inevitable and important questions about facts and faith. Instead of punting on those questions," and here I think he was referring, I think it was Scott Walker who was asked about evolution, and he said, "I'm going to punt on that." Krauss said, "We owe it to the next generation to plant the seeds of doubt." And so for being such a prolific planter of those very important seeds, it is now my distinct honor and privilege to award the 2015 Humanist of the Year Award to Dr. Lawrence M. Krauss.
Thank you. There's several unprecedented things I'm going to do tonight. One is I'm not wearing Chucks. This was too prestigious an event for that, I thought. It's a great privilege to be here at the same night as Marcy. I've been so impressed with what she's been doing. And in fact, it reminded me when you mentioned Steve Weinberg, I'll talk about the fact that this means a great deal to me because of the group of people who've received this award. Steve Weinberg was a former recipient of this, and he would definitely say that, as he often says, that you are doing God's work. And so I'm very pleased about that. The other unprecedented thing is I've written down my remarks, which I almost never do. There are a few reasons for that. One, I learned that I have to prepare a written version for the humanists. And I've been up for about 40 hours, and I realized that I wouldn't remember what I said if I didn't write it down. So that's why I've written it. But it's also for another reason. This, as I said, this really means a lot to me because of the group of people, the remarkable group of people who've been awarded this prize, and it's really humbling. And because also humanism means a great deal to me. It's a central part of what I've tried to do in my personal and professional and public life. And therefore, I take this award very seriously. In fact, in my opinion, it's perhaps the greatest honor I've ever received. So I really do appreciate that from this group. It's also the first time I've spoken before God as well. So it's another reason I thought I should be formal. I want to. There's a number of topics that have been actually discussed tonight that I want to pick up on, and I want to pick up on doubt. I want to follow up on that piece I wrote in the New Yorker and address some of those issues. And I want to begin with a quote. The New Yorker edits more than any other place I've ever written for, and that 1,500-word piece I think took 4 months of editing, and a lot of the good stuff went out. So I've been thinking about it since then. I want to begin with a quote by a physicist who didn't win the Humanist Award but should have, Richard Feynman. In 1988, he said, "Permit us to question, to doubt, that's all, and not to be sure. It's our responsibility to proclaim the value of this freedom, to teach how doubt is not to be feared but welcomed and discussed, and to demand this freedom as our duty to all coming generations." And that's what I want to focus on today. Humanism, to me, can be summed up as follows. It's up to us to determine the nature of the way that we carry on our lives, using a combination of reason, intelligence, and compassion. No one is taking care of us but us. Bad decisions produce bad consequences, and we must take responsibility for those bad decisions, and if possible, take actions to mediate or alleviate them. Whether or not the future for our children is better than the past is up to us. Now, we are constrained in that regard, as we've actually heard in the last presentation, by the cumulative historical impact of ignorance and greed and the struggle for power. And that's often accentuated by governments and religious church organizations, including churches, whose interests always lie in permeating myths that build support for the status quo, that stifle and squelch calls for change. So therefore, when we talk about change for the future and making the future better, we'll always encounter numerous obstacles that will get in the way. But as has been pointed out, I'm a theoretical physicist. And that means I don't worry about practicalities. I worry about possibilities. And I would argue that if we don't first imagine the possible future, we will never implement the practical steps that it takes to get there. So tonight I want to suggest that humanism offers the world one of the most important drivers of change that can improve our future. And I may seem naive in my optimism, which is rare. I'm emboldened, in fact, by the recent, as Marcy pointed out, the recent experience in this country regarding gay marriage. In spite of what the media say and what middle-aged senators may say, the issue of gay marriage is over. It's a done deal. Why? My daughter's here. If you speak to a person her age, they don't even understand what the problem is. Almost all of them who have friends are gay or know gay couples and cannot understand what the previous generation was concerned about. Now, if the public and legal debate isn't over now, it will be, because soon those people will be old enough to not only vote, but to judge, to represent the media, to run for office, and the debate's going to be just over. No one will even want to have it. This would have been unheard of a generation ago and merely a decade ago. So how can change happen so quickly? Well, Max Planck, a well-known physicist, once said that physics proceeds funeral by funeral. And what he meant by that was that old theories never die, but old theorists do. And when they do, they take their theories with them. So a new generation is always more comfortable dispensing with old ideas than are their predecessors. So I want to argue here that it's possible to imagine a future without the tyranny of religious myth and superstition and its chokehold on supposed morality.
and it's possible to imagine such a future soon. We are never more than one generation away from change. The key is reaching the next generation while they're young. There's happily been a great deal of discussion of late about the importance of encouraging children, particularly young girls, to go into careers in science, technology, and engineering and mathematics, often called STEM. From an economic perspective, it's a really good idea because in the 20th century, those countries without a workforce with STEM skills will fall by the wayside. It's good for the world because the challenges of the 21st century, from global warming to energy production and storage, will require technological innovation, as well as institutional changes at the global level. And it's good for girls and young women, because these careers will help empower them and raise many out of potential poverty and free them from subjugation by men. By exposing children to science, it's far more than merely providing them with Lego sets and sink or float games. Providing a set of facts is not the primary purpose of education. Teaching how to distinguish fact from fiction and fantasy, how to derive facts by questioning and testing, and where to go to access reliable data. That's what education's all about. The most important goal in educating our children should be to encourage them to question absolutely everything, to not be satisfied with unsubstantiated claims, to be skeptical of a priori beliefs, either of their own or their parents or their teachers. Encouraging skeptical thinking in this way, as well as directing a process by which questions may be answered through the process of empirical investigation, followed by logical reasoning, helps create lifelong learners and citizens who can responsibly address the demands of a democratic society. There's overwhelming evidence, by the way, that one of the key collateral benefits of a more scientifically literate populace is that the seeds of religious doubt are thereby planted among the next generation. My friend, the late Christopher Hitchens, once said that religion poisons everything. There's ample room to debate this statement. Even people who take a less extreme view must admit that in the current climate, religion is poisoning the political process in many places throughout the world. The brutal terrorism of ISIS is just one extreme. In this country, numerous Republicans are now tripping over themselves to move to the right of the religious right. And the recent House freshman class is a good example. Includes a former Navy SEAL who claims Hillary Clinton is the Antichrist, another who claims recent blood moons are fulfilling biblical prophecies, and another who proposed reclassifying single parenthood as child abuse. Yes. So the purpose of education is not to destroy religious belief. But surely, as Richard Feynman alluded to in the quote at the beginning of this talk, its purpose is to encourage doubt. And in that area, we're clearly falling short. And at least one significant factor, it seems to me, arises from an unwillingness enforced by the terror in the Middle East and political correctness in the US to openly ridicule in the public arena, and we heard about this, to openly ridicule in the public arena patently false and nonsensical claims, as long as they're religious claims. This is particularly important in the current climate associated with the satire of the type represented by Charlie Hebdo. And in fact, I have to disagree with you a little, Marcy, about that. I was thinking about that during your talk, because the papers are still not exposing things appropriately. And one of the things, I wrote a piece about this because it got me so mad, that the New York Times wrote 2 articles about the cover of Charlie Hebdo, but refused to show the cover. Okay? And I wrote to them, and I was appalled, because they thought it would offend sensibilities. They also published pictures of the terrorists shooting a guard on the sidewalk, a helpless individual. That wasn't offensive. But publishing the pictures of Charlie Hebdo was. And that kind of political correctness is just disgusting. And I talked to the New York Times about it at the time. Very few Americans support openly questioning or satirizing religious beliefs, even though they would be loath to stifle questioning and debate and even ridicule in almost any other area of the public arena. In a recent Pew survey published last May, the #1 negative trait listed for possible presidential candidates by U.S. adults was atheism. 53% of adults indicated that they would be less likely to vote for an atheist as president, more than would be similarly inclined if the potential candidate had never held public office, had had an affair, or were gay or lesbian. Well, I suppose that's one good aspect of the whole thing. Avoiding confrontations with religion is not restricted to politics, however. Many scientists and teachers do it. Recent studies, including a comprehensive national survey by researchers at Penn State, which was talked about in 2007, show that 60% of high school biology teachers shy away from adequately teaching evolution as a unifying principle of biology. I remember that when my daughter was in a liberal school and they didn't want to use the word evolution. They don't want to risk the potential controversy by offending religious sensibilities. Instead, many resort to the idea advocated by the late Stephen Jay Gould that science and religion are non-overlapping magisteria. That means separate traditions of thinking that need not contradict one another. Now, those in the public sphere, and that includes me, who have openly questioned the need for God or the consistency of religious doctrine with empirical evidence, are most often dismissed as strident. I first learned that with my friend Richard Dawkins, who I first thought was strident. Sadly, many of those who express such a reaction are not religious fundamentalists, but fellow scientists, and I get criticized all the time. The claim is made, and it's a claim I used to make myself, that if scientists openly question the existence of God, then we'll alienate those who already view science as the enemy of faith, further hardening their stand against teaching concepts like the evolution, the Big Bang, or climate change, and making it more difficult to break down barriers to education. But by arguing in public, and in many cases against their own internal beliefs or views, I don't like to use the word belief, their own internal views, by arguing that science presents no challenge to religious belief, my colleagues are being disingenuous. While science can't falsify the vague possibility that there may be purpose to the universe, nevertheless, the specific claims of the scriptures are in most cases empirically falsifiable, and those that are have been falsified. Non-overlapping magisteria has a nice ring to it. The problem is that there are many religious claims that not only overlap with empirical data, but are incompatible with it. As a scientist who also spends a fair amount of time in the public arena, if I'm asked if our understanding of the Big Bang conflicts with a 6,000-year-old universe, I face a choice. I can betray my scientific values or encourage that person to doubt his or her own beliefs. Scientists who argue that we shouldn't focus on these embarrassing contradictions are misrepresenting the key facet of science itself, the facet that Feynman so extolled in his quote. Science at its basis encourages open expressions of doubt, and progress in science often occurs by disproving the accepted wisdom of a previous generation. It seems inconsistent to have no problem ridiculing the claims of astrology, for example, even though a significant fraction of the public believes in astrology, while arguing that to suggest that various religious tenets are poorly founded in reality hurts the cause of science. That's hypocritical. Without demeaning the thoughtful faithful, we shouldn't shy away from publicly accepting that many of the specific claims of the sacred books of the world's major religions are not valid. One need not turn to the numerous contradictions with known physics and cosmology, which I won't talk about here. After all, many books, including my own, have discussed these, and we have to realize that most of the so-called sacred books were written before people knew the Earth orbited the Sun. There are simpler falsehoods, from the existence of domesticated camels in the time of Abraham, which we now know were not domesticated, to Muhammad's famous night journey to a mosque in Jerusalem, in spite of the fact that there were no mosques in Jerusalem at the time, to the fact that one of the central holy books of the Mormon faith, an Egyptian papyrus translated into the Book of Abraham, unfortunately was translated before I've been up so long, I love to see it in London, what's it called? The Rosetta Stone. It was translated a year before the Rosetta Stone, unfortunately for the Mormons, because after the Rosetta Stone, that book is now known to be the burial rites for Ra. one of the central books of the Mormon religion. I tried to publish that in the New York Times, and they wouldn't publish it. There may be places in the world where one might risk decapitation for questioning some of these claims, but in a rational world, it's hard to argue that questioning these or a host of other dubious repute should be viewed as inappropriate. Education at its heart is inseparable from teaching doubt. It's good to be skeptical, especially about ideas you learn from perceived authority figures. Recent studies suggest that even being taught to doubt as a young child could make people better lifelong learners. That in turn means that doubters, people who base their views on evidence rather than faith, are likely to be better citizens. Last year in the New York Times, political scientist Brendan Nyhan explained how identity often trumps the facts. We would rather reject evidence than change our sense of who we are. Knowledge is comparatively helpless against identity. As you grow better informed about the issues, you just get better at selectively using evidence to reinforce your pre-existing commitments. A 2014 Yale Law School study, for example, demonstrated that the divergence between religious and non-religious people's views on evolution actually grows wider among those who are familiar with math and science. Describing his work in The New Yorker, Maria Konnikova summarized his findings by writing that it's only after ideology is put to the side that the facts become decoupled from notions of self-perception. If we want to raise citizens who are better at making evidence-based judgments, we need to start early, making skepticism and doubt part of the experience that shapes the identities of young people as early as we can. Earlier this year, an AP-GFK poll revealed that less than a third of Americans are willing to express confidence in the reality of human-induced climate change, evolution, and the age of the Earth, and the existence of the Big Bang. Among those surveyed, there was a direct correlation between religious conviction and an unwillingness to accept the results of empirical scientific investigation. Religious beliefs vary widely, of course, and not all faiths or all faithful people are the same. But it seems fair to say, nevertheless, that religious faith appears to be an obstacle to understanding the world. And it is an obstacle that may begin early. Last summer, a new study published in the journal Cognitive Science claimed to find a significant difference in the ability of children as young as 5 or 6 years old to distinguish fact and fantasy, depending upon their past exposure to religious education in church or parochial school. The children with religious training, they came from many different religious backgrounds, were less able to judge that characters in fantasy stories were fictional rather than real compared to children with no such exposure. I was very excited about that, and I wanted to put it in the New York article, but I didn't, because it was a crummy study. It was done at a school of education in those schools, that's why. The methodology was badly flawed. And we should, but I would like to encourage people who can do good studies, because I suspect it's true. You can look at the paper, and I did, and I realized it presupposed the answer before it asked the question, which is more religious than scientific. By planting the seeds of doubt, education offers the best opportunity to immunize children against the intellectual virus that is associated with dogma and superstition in the world today. Now, science class isn't the only place where students can learn to be skeptical. A provocative novel that presents a completely foreign worldview, or a history lesson exploring the vastly different mores of the past, can push you to skeptically reassess your inherited view of the world. But science is a place where such confrontation is explicit and accessible. It doesn't take more than a simple experiment. It didn't take more than a simple experiment for Galileo to overturn the wisdom of Aristotle. Informed doubt is the very essence of science. Some teachers shy away from confronting religious beliefs because they worry that planting the seeds of doubt will cause some students to question or abandon their own faith or the faith of their parents. But is that such a bad thing? It offers some young people the chance to escape the guilt imposed upon them simply for questioning what they're told. I get emails every week, and recently I received an email from a 27-year-old man who's now studying in the United States after growing up in Saudi Arabia. His father was executed by family members after converting to Christianity. He says that it's learning about science that's finally liberated him from the specter of religious fundamentalism. In the same week, I received an email from a young man who lives in Indiana. He feels isolated and damaged because of the reaction of his family and friends to his rejection of religion and his love of science. I get emails like this every single day. We owe it to these young people to help them feel, as another young letter writer put it that week, that, quote, I'm not the only one who has these thoughts. Is it naive to imagine that we can overcome centuries of religious intransigence in a single generation through education? Maybe. But as Nelson Mandela said about going from prisoner to president in the span of a generation, it always seems impossible until it's done. The stakes are too high to not try. And as Feynman warned us a generation ago, and I quote from him, it is our responsibility to leave the men, forgive me, he wrote it at a sexist time, to leave the men of the future with a free hand. In the impetuous youth of humanity, we can make grave errors that can stunt our growth for a long time. This we will do if we, so young and ignorant, say we have the answers now. If we suppress all discussion, all criticism, saying, this is it, boys, man is saved. Thus we can doom man for a long time to the chains of authority, confined to the limits of our present imagination. And that's what we have to fight against. And that's what this organization is involved in, and why I'm so honored to get this award. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We do have time for a few questions. Maggie's got the mic.
Hopefully there are none, and I can go to sleep.
Hello. You did mention the Big Bang.
Yes.
And I've always wondered to myself how, when you're talking to people, I mean, I know nothing about it actually, but it approaches metaphysics. But when you talk to the skeptics, they say, well, what was there before the Big Bang? And I have to say, I have the same question myself. I have no idea.
There's a new answer. Just buy my book. No, I mean, the simple answer is we don't know. That's the best answer you can provide, and parents and teachers are too afraid. I learned that from my wife, who's also here. The parents and teachers are too afraid to say, I don't know. It's an open question. But there's a huge difference between not knowing and never knowing. I get told all the time that science will never explain love or explain whatever. What incredible conceit is that? Because it implies you know what the limits are. But you never know what the limits are until you try. And so I don't know whether we'll ever know. In fact, it turns out the question is probably not a good question, okay? That's the simplest answer. Because there may be no before. Time itself may have arisen in the Big Bang. Because space and time are tied together by general relativity. So when space is created, and space can be created from nothing, as I described in my last book, time is created from nothing. So there simply may be no before, and all classical notions of cause and effect and all the things that we tend to think are logical go out the window. But the universe doesn't give a damn about what we think is logical. That's what we learned in the 20th century in physics. We have to force our logic to conform to the evidence of reality. So that question may be a bad question, just like why is there something rather than nothing may be a bad question. And that's okay to say people say, well, you know, you've changed the rules. You changed the definitions on me. And I call that learning. Anyway.
We have a question right over here.
Yeah.
If humans have to leave the Earth because of global warming, what planet would they go to? How would they go to? How would they get there? And if there is life and civilizations on the planet, wouldn't that lead to war for it?
My friend Stephen Hawking has written about this recently. Well, the answer is, it always amazes me that people somehow think it's easier to take spacecraft to inhabit another planet than to solve the problems on our own. I mean, I find it amazing. It always seems easier. And it's just a heck, people talk about mining asteroids, and it's just, traveling in space is damn difficult, and humans are not the best means for traveling in space. I happen to think from a scientific perspective, human space exploration is a waste of time, in my opinion, and money. I'm in huge favor of space exploration. I think robots do a great job of it, and as I often say, we can send a rover to Mars for the price of making a movie about sending Bruce Willis to Mars. And, but nevertheless, I do think that space exploration from a sort of adventure point of view is an essential part of human. We want to do it, and as long as we're honest about it. I testified before the House Committee on Science Technology, which is run by several people now who don't believe in global warming or the Big Bang, about that. And I think, look, as long as we make the difference between science and adventure, it's fine. Obviously, if you wanted to choose a planet to move to, then the best planet is Mars. There's no doubt about that at this point. It's the closest to Earth. It's still almost in the habitable zone. And you could imagine at some point colonizing. But it's not easy. And it's certainly not a short-term solution to any of the major problems. And that's what worries me. Because sure, we should think about diversifying the human species. In the long term, we're screwed. Okay? I mean, in the long term, the Earth is gone, if you worry about billions of years. And I can't resist telling my only cosmology joke. Okay? Which someone says like that, I say something like that, and someone rushes with their hands and says, "Did you say millions of years?" And I say, "No, billions." And they go, "Phew, okay, good." But it's not a short-term solution to the problems on Earth. What saddens me is that people seem to suggest that there's no way of addressing the problems we're creating, and there are. And there will be there are social solutions that are needed, but there are technological solutions that are possible. And we shouldn't have a defeatist attitude. So we should, sure, diversify and move to other planets in the long term of the human species if we want the species to survive for billions of years, or maybe even millions of years, because there are asteroids one day that will be heading towards us and other things. But we need to focus on the problems here and now before we even consider that, in my opinion. I know all the good applause lines, so it's easy. So sorry. Yes?
Last year, Max Tegmark was here, and he talked to us about one of the things that he's studying is using physics, essentially, to perhaps come up with consciousness, and using science.
Oh, dear, I wish you hadn't talked about that.
Actually, I don't think he did it here. Actually, I think that might have been at the New York Academy of Sciences, but he mentioned it here. I was actually just wondering, because some of the things that he brought up were very philosophical as opposed to merely physics or cosmology.
That's when they become, you mean when they become philosophical, that's a code word for becoming devoid of content.
You may have preemptively actually answered my question. I was just wondering, with the knowledge and the studies that you've done, have you come up with philosophical type questions that we might be interested in, but perhaps not? Look, we're all philosophers. I don't want to demean philosophy because we all do it. There's a difference now. There didn't used to be a difference in science and philosophy. Now there is. And I worry about people who, and I don't want to criticize Max because I didn't hear what he said, but it's all, there are so many books written about consciousness because we understand almost nothing about it. There's, Newton wrote the Principia. You only needed that to understand gravity. And once you got it, you don't need 1,000 books. Okay? Consciousness is a very, very complicated thing, and there's no understanding of it now. And physics, people think I'm being facetious when I say that I'm a physicist because it's the easy thing. It's easier. But it is. We deal with the easiest questions. That's why it's so successful. And we will, I expect, one day understand consciousness, perhaps. I see no obstacle to that in the long term. But it's a long, hard road. Biology is an incredibly complicated area, and we're making huge strides. But let me try and address your question more generously. Philosophy is useful, in my opinion, in those areas where scientific questions are not well defined. Philosophy helps guide questioning. And throughout the history of science, it's been very useful. But at some point, science matures and leaves philosophy by the wayside. In physics, the philosophy of physics is irrelevant. It really is. No physicists read it. Most of them can't spell philosophy. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. I don't mean it's not an area worth studying as an intellectual sense. It just doesn't impact the progress of science. Because once those questions are well defined, the way to resolve them is empirically. And that's a scientific process. You don't resolve them by speculation or revelation or internal thinking. That's not the way science works. If you locked theoretical physicists in a room and asked them 30 years from now what would be the theory of the time, they would come up with something completely wrong. Because the imagination of nature so far exceeds the imagination of human beings that we need to keep looking out and questioning the universe. And that's what science is all about. And so philosophy has had a useful role to play in pushing science forward. And in areas, and my friend Dan Dennett is a philosopher, for example, and in areas of neuroscience where things are poorly defined right now, it's useful for philosophers like Dan to come up with thought experiments and questions about what consciousness might be or what thinking might be, because we don't have the scientific tools at this point to analyze it. So there is a productive role there. But in areas that are very mature, like physics, in my opinion, there isn't. And when physicists, as it often happens, especially as they get older, start talking like philosophers, you should be skeptical.
I'm involved in a nonprofit called The Long Now, and one of the projects that we're doing is developing a manual for civilization that will last 10,000 years. So I have two questions for you. One, are there any amazing works that you think have to be in there? But two is a more complicated question.
You mean besides the universe from nothing? No, I'm just joking. Sorry. Okay.
The second part of the question that I'm interested in hearing from you as a science educator and communicator is right now our collection is completely devoid of books like the Bible. Primarily because if everything, let's say we lost all knowledge other than whatever we're putting forward. And for example, we did put a new Rosetta Stone on the Philae. So that's one of the things that we're doing that's kind of awesome. Anyway, so if we lose everything, all that's left is this manual for civilization that we're creating. How do you feel about leaving out books like the Bible and other religious texts?
Oh, no, I think that's a mistake. I mean, you know, first of all, I have to admit I'm a little skeptical because civilization changes, and I don't think there's constancy. And so I don't think, I certainly hope that what we now know is not a guide for civilization 10,000 years from now. That's why I do science, right? Because I hope what we now know isn't a guide for me a year from now. And so I worry about that. But nevertheless, if you ask what are great books or what are books that have been important in human history, certainly religious books have been very important. And by the way, to answer, related to the last question, the role that philosophy has played in science is also somewhat true for religion. Okay? Religion was a precursor to science. And, you know, people point that out to me. They say, well, you know, Newton was religious, and, you know, and so how can you, and the point is, well, first of all, in that time, you know, the church was the National Science Foundation. It was the only place to get an education. It was the only place to fund research. But that's fine. It's okay to have a relationship, but you grow up, okay? Parents are useful for children, but the whole point is children grow up and move beyond their parents. We certainly hope that's the case, those of us who are good parents. And my daughter can say whether that's true or not. But so I think we have to say, sure, there are relationships. And to ignore those relationships historically is a shame, because I also love history. And so we need to understand the historical antecedents, as I tried to argue in my talk, if we want to understand how to frame the current questions and to look for solutions. Okay.
All right, this will be the last question.
Okay.
in attacking religion, we seem to cause religionists to take a firm stand to defend their religion. What do you think as a better method we could use to prove this good without God concept that the American Humanist Association is pushing, and get religionists to say, okay, you're good without God, we're good with God, we're both good, we can respect you, as a first step. Once we reach that step, then we can convince the other people to come along with our viewpoints.
I don't want people to, let me just say that I'm totally against what your last sentence. I don't want anyone to come along with my viewpoint. I just want people to think for themselves, okay? That's all I want. And so I don't want followers, I don't want a movement, okay? I just want people to be able to have the freedom and be encouraged and the tools for being able to think for themselves, okay? Now, if I had a magic bullet, if I had the solution to the problem you presented, I'd be giving it. It's a difficult issue. I think there are two things. First, we don't attack, we ask questions. Okay? Asking questions is the best way, I think, to create dialogue. And also to get people to examine their own misconceptions. As a physicist, and I think I talked about in The Unbelievers to Richard, the best tool we have is people's misconceptions. Because there's a lot of pedagogical research that says the only way people really learn is by confronting their own misconceptions. And the example I used is things let me give you an example. It's a long answer to this question, but I'm sorry, I'm going to give it anyway. I was once addressing the leaders of the free world, and I asked them, I won't take your computer and do it, but I got a piece of paper and a heavy book. And I asked them which would, if I dropped them, which would hit the ground first. And of course, they all said the heavy book, and I did the experiment for them. And I remember James Fallows was there, and he was amazed that I was brave enough to do the experiment, but I knew how it would work out, so it was no bravery whatsoever. But then, this will break if I drop it. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to take your book. Okay, I'm going to do the experiment for you, okay? So I did this. They were absolutely right. And then, of course, I asked the key question, why? And 50% of those leaders of the free world said, because this is heavier. Now, they'd all learned in school that Galileo showed that wasn't the case. So I did the following experiment. Okay? In one moment, all of them will remember that that misconception was a misconception. And so I think the best way to try and reach people, to get them to doubt, which is what my whole point about, is to get them to confront their misconceptions the same way scientists do. We ask questions, not about others, but about ourselves. As Feynman also said, as a scientist, you try and prove your theories right, but you also try and prove them wrong. That's the key point. You're constantly second-guessing and ask if you can prove them wrong. To answer the second part of your question, I think this is what this organization is about. And one of the things I'm happiest about the movie, The Unbelievers, frankly, is the letters I get from kids and older people throughout the country saying, I'm not alone, and there are lots of good people who feel the way I do. So the way we have to do it is just have more and more people be able to show that they doubt, but they still are good, honest, reasonable people. And that's and to be able to express that openly and to condemn those people publicly who claim the opposite is true. Don't let those lies go unanswered. Thank you.